And thank you all for joining us tonight. We're hoping to have an interesting and maybe a little bit different kind of event tonight than we normally do. See, solve, scale. These simple words have taken on new meaning with the release of Danny Warshay's book on March 22nd of 22. That's about 2 weeks ago. The book was inspired by Danny's course on the entrepreneurial process at Brown, where Danny has taught for 17 years, following a very successful entrepreneurial career of his own. His startup experience began while Danny was still an undergraduate at Brown. Danny was part of a team that launched Clearview Software, later acquired by Apple in 1989. Danny's course at Brown has been acknowledged as the highest rated course on campus, the testament not only to his entrepreneurial talent and teaching skill, but also to the fact that Danny is just a really, really nice guy. Danny, welcome to Long Now, Boston.
Thank you so much, George. Thank you, Jennifer, for that kind introduction earlier. And thank you to all of you for being here this evening. It's a real pleasure. And I know of Long Now through my affiliation with George through the RSA. And anybody who's read the book already knows that I mention and highlight Long Now in the book. And we'll talk perhaps a little bit about why that is, but it's a real honor to be here today. And I know we're doing this virtually and there's some benefits to doing that. I look forward in the not too distant future to be with as many of you as possible as we can when we gather together again in person. And there's an open invitation for anybody on this call or anybody affiliated with Long Now to join us at this, which is depicted behind me, the Nelson Center for Entrepreneurship at Brown. If you're in the area or if you'd like to be in the area, please reach out and I'd be happy to host you there. So very nice to be here this evening.
And Danny, I know you've already set up a group on LinkedIn for anybody that wants to participate in an online way with the content of your book and where that goes in the future. So
that's true. In fact, you're a member of it. So as is Bob Johnston, who is one of our colleagues, also from RSA and one of my collaborators, and there's others. It's a growing group. So I very much wanted from the very beginning, readers and supporters, listeners. There's an audio version too that I narrate. So I also always have to play fair with listeners to be able to continue learning from each other in an interactive way. And so yes, on LinkedIn, there's a See, Solve, Scale group and it's already active. So anybody here tonight, I'll consider at least a supporter, if not yet a listener or a reader. So you're invited to join that group.
And to start this off tonight, we're going to give away a copy of Danny's book, See, Solve, Scale. Yeah, there we go. I've got it on my screen. You've got it on yours. We've done this a number of times before. What we do is we ask a question based on content from the book. And the first person to give the correct response in the chat will win the book, and we'll figure out a way to get a signature if you want it, or get an audiobook if you want that. Here's the question, and this is an open book question, open book quiz. So think about it, take a look, and then post your answer as quickly as you can in the chat. Mary's going to help identify who the winner is, and we'll then talk to you offline. So here's the question. One of Danny's collaborators featured in the book started an innovative and groundbreaking product launch that became an iconic cultural meme in just 56 days. It achieved national recognition and had more than 1 million customers on January 21, 2017. So we want to know what that product was. So that's the question. Put your answer in the chat. Somebody can figure it out. I'm sure somebody may have read the book. So while we wait for the answer, tell us about that. That case study. Was this individual a typical business candidate?
No, I guess I shouldn't give away the answer as I'm discussing the details, but this was a person who I think in many ways is who this book is geared toward, and who my teaching for 17 years is geared toward. And we're going to even watch on video a couple of examples of this. The book is replete with examples of people who themselves wouldn't have considered themselves to be a likely entrepreneur, unexpected entrepreneur, maybe a reluctant entrepreneur. And this is a person who studied visual arts and economics at Brown and went on to the Harvard Design School and got a degree in architecture, and took a strong interest in design, which is maybe another hint for the question, and then wanted to have a real impact on the social movements that were arising in early 2017, in particular, and maybe I'll slowly give some more hints, in particular, the women's movement, which lots of us support, many of us on this Zoom event, I'm sure do. And there was a challenge for her because she wanted to attend the events happening in Washington, big marches, but she had a serious injury that prevented her from doing that. And she nevertheless wanted to figure out how to, we have somebody who I think is not only identifying, it's really extra credit for Josiah, because not only identifying the icon, but even the entrepreneur behind the icon. Yeah, Jana Zweiman was a Brown grad who I don't think would have considered herself an entrepreneur, but she was unable to go to Washington to march to support women's rights. And she figured out that there would be a way to empower many others through creating knitting circles across the country. And she circulated a very simple diagram of how to create a hat in pink yarn. And those pink hats became known as pussy hats. And Jana Zweiman was the founder of the Pussy Hat movement. And it spread like crazy across the country. Literally within 56 days, millions of people, including me, were wearing pink hats at women's rights marches. And we see others like Jennifer wore that hat. And it was a really good example of the See, Solve, Scale method in practice. She saw a problem that she wanted to solve, and she really understood it viscerally. She solved it very quickly, much more quickly typically than I outline in the book. And that scaled very dramatically. There's pictures in the book, and we've all seen them on the cover of Time magazine and on PBS and all over the place, of literally millions of people wearing this hat. And so I'm glad you asked about that particular example, because it's a really good example of the breadth, the range of the types of entrepreneurs that my teaching has empowered through the years. And the way I define entrepreneurship is very expansively as a structured process for solving problems. And it may or may not have a commercial angle to it. In this case, actually, it didn't. And but it was clearly aimed at solving a problem. And so I love talking about Jana, and also about the solution that she chose to overcome some constraints that she had about her own ability to attend a march. And so I'm really proud of Jana. I'm really proud of her contributions to the book. And Jana also has continued to leverage the same model that she used in the Pussy Hat Project through other political movements, including ones to support newcomers to the United States, new immigrants, through a project called the Welcome Blanket Project, and use the same kind of model to scale that very quickly. And so again, I'm happy that you started with that example, because there's others that are a little bit more conventional, but many that are not. And I'm glad we started one that's not.
Yeah, that's great. And it's also an example of the serial process of,
Yes.
one thing leading to another. And I think it's a great example. So we have a winner, Josiah. Congratulations. Mary will follow up with you so we can get the book, copy of the book off to you. And Danny, for me, and when I was reading your book, it didn't come across like a business primer. It was readable. It's readable. It's entertaining. You've got lots of stories and examples in there. And part of that has to be the audience that you were originally asked to teach. Tell us just a bit about the course and the mission that that you had in teaching that course.
Well, first of all, I'm glad that it doesn't come across as a business primary, because it's not intended to be. It is intended to be a guide that the course was intended to be for anybody looking to identify and then solve a consequential problem that over the long term can have real dramatic impact at scale. And maybe I'll just rewind fully to back 17 years ago when I got a very unexpected tap on the shoulder. And this was, midway through my career, which was full of all sorts of my own entrepreneurial activity. You mentioned, or maybe Jennifer mentioned, but back in when I was a student at Brown, I studied history, and I was a big proponent then, and I am now as well, for liberal arts being an excellent grounding for anything, and especially entrepreneurship. And I kind of fell into this opportunity to join this team that was starting a software company. I knew nothing about software. I knew nothing about entrepreneurship or business, but we built that up, and we eventually sold it to Apple. And in most of my career had been doing that, a series of successful startups. And then that unexpected tap on the shoulder in 2005 came from a beloved professor of mine, Barrett Hazeltine. And he said, "We'd like you to come back to Brown." I had gone to Harvard Business School and got an MBA at Harvard. And he said, "Take one of your Harvard courses. You went to Brown. You're kind of familiar with our unorthodox curriculum, and we'd like you to teach entrepreneurship at Brown." And you can't really say no to Barrett Hazeltine. So even though I wasn't sure what he was talking about, I said yes. And then I realized Brown doesn't have a business school like Harvard did. And what does it mean to teach entrepreneurship in dominantly a liberal arts environment? And I realized, well, a lot of people talk about this phrase. Maybe people on this call themselves have heard it, entrepreneurial spirit. I'm sure lots of people have heard that phrase. But I had no idea really what it meant. And I thought, well, I can't be asked to teach a spirit. I'm not really sure what that would mean. And then I realized, you know what, at the engineering school, which is where my faculty appointment was, imagine if we were to teach somebody how to build a bridge. We wouldn't say, just go out there and teach the bridge building spirit. And if the bridge just falls down and the cars and trucks crash down to earth, then just go out and have more spirit. That would be insane. We wouldn't be trusted to teach anything. And yet I found that was the way we were being traditionally told about helping people learn entrepreneurship. And I thought, no, in bridge building, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There's a structured process where you can distill certain fundamental traits of bridge building that can apply to any type of bridge, even though there's lots of bridge variation. And I thought in entrepreneurship, there must be something similar. And those of you who've watched the video in preparation for tonight, you know that I figured out that there's these 3 steps that all entrepreneurial ventures have in common. One is to find that original problem that you're looking to solve. If that's what entrepreneurship is, solving problems, we better start with the problem. A second step is developing an initial small scale solution and doing it iteratively with lots of tolerance for failure along the way. And eventually, once we've figured out that solution, to layer on resources that'll enable that small scale solution to scale and have real dramatic impact. And so the kinds of students I began to attract were from all across the university, who in many cases probably couldn't even spell the word entrepreneurship, but they were really interested in learning and mastering and then applying a methodology, a structured process that you could use to figure out solutions to problems. And that's been the case in all my years of teaching at Brown. And I've also taught at Yale and at Tel Aviv University School of Business and in workshops and other formats in different places around the world. So I learned that this unorthodox approach that was born out of the lack of a business school has pretty significant appeal all over the world.
Yeah. So you have a video clip of one of your students, Emma Butler, that I think would be a nice introduction to sort of how that pans out, teaching liberal arts, teaching people from disciplines that are unrelated to business and, don't think they can possibly do anything. And yet you have a way of teaching that structured process that gives them some tools to be able to accomplish some pretty interesting results. So do you have that? Can you cue up that
I
video for
do.
us?
Sure. Let's see. The book, as you know, is See, Solve, Scale: How Anyone Can Turn an Unsolved Problem into a Breakthrough Success, underscore anyone. And you always come to mind. In fact, I describe you in the book as a reluctant entrepreneur. Can you rewind and just share with us the short story about your first exposure to entrepreneurship in my course?
Absolutely. I had no idea that I was ever going to be an entrepreneur. I didn't know what entrepreneurship was. I didn't know anything about what the methodology of becoming an entrepreneur was. As a visual arts and French student at Brown, I really didn't think I was prepared to do the financial modeling, to think critically about entrepreneurship, to do the Harvard Business School case studies. I didn't think I had anything in me, let alone after the course to build a company. But as I walked in, quite literally shaking because I was so nervous that I was going to be called on, or that it was going to be too hard on the first day and I was going to have to drop out right there and then, and be so embarrassing. I sat there and you briefly explained a little bit about this See, Solve, Scale methodology. And I thought, I can understand that. That's something that I can digest. And that's a great first step. See, I can do that. I can find a problem. I know a problem and it's an unmet need. Okay, I got that. And so being able to break it down into these digestible steps was really great for somebody like me that was really starting at ground zero. The problem with Intimately, it was a personal one. About 10 years ago, my mom became disabled and it became extremely difficult for her to find clothing that she could get on independently that was both functional and fashionable. And so the problem that we're solving is making sure that the 600 million women worldwide that have some sort of disability that affects the way they dress have options in clothing that is both functional and fashionable and can bring them confidence. And Intimately, we're in the scale stage. We just closed our seed round of $1 million led by the British Fashion Council as their very first investment. I'm currently based in Paris. Our team of about 5 full-time women who are both disabled and non-disabled are living in the States. We've just released our first line that was launched in Vogue Business, Business of Fashion. We've been in Forbes, Glamour, Cosmopolitan, and we're ready to take this scale and go all the way with it.
So Danny, that was awesome. It's really really amazing to hear that story. And as an educator and coach, you have to feel pretty good about that.
I'm so proud of Emma. I'm so proud of all my students. And Emma is just representative of many, but she's at the same time really extraordinary. There's so many things I love about that short video. First of all, I love the way she tells her own story so well that in the book, I had Emma write her own story to account for the way she experienced the course and the methodology, the way she felt uncertainty about her own ability to be an entrepreneur, and how she overcame that and used this process to identify a problem that's really consequential and really significant for her mom and for many women around the world, to figure out on a small scale, very iteratively, with small resources, how to solve it. And now, as she said, she's starting to enter the scaling part of that, where she's attracted over $1 million in seed funding and starting to do manufacturing. And I couldn't be more proud of Emma, but especially because I think she's an exemplar of, lots of people who are being empowered by this method. It's what I've loved about teaching in general and about teaching entrepreneurship at Brown for so long, which is that it is empowering lots of people who've been, I would say, ignored, at least neglected, perhaps even discriminated against. I mean, the statistics in entrepreneurship, mainstream entrepreneurship, are really pathetic. Among venture-backed entrepreneurs, only 2.3% are women, only 1.5% are Latinx, and only 1% are Black. And that's just shameful. And we need to do something to change it. And part of the mission of my teaching, of the Center for Entrepreneurship at Brown, and of the book, and maybe you'll ask me, where the heck did this book come from, is to help overcome some of that and to engage, inspire, empower lots of those kinds of people who've been neglected and ignored and maybe discriminated against, and help them, like Emma, realize, no, I can do this. And I'm as legitimate a candidate for entrepreneurship in the broadest sense, the way we describe it, of problem solving, as anybody. So yeah, I'm incredibly proud of Emma and all the work she's doing.
Yeah, one of the things that comes out in the book, and obviously you're very passionate about the fact that, you don't start from it's a business standpoint, it's business about. You start from the standpoint of, this is a skill set and a structured process that can apply to anyone in any field. It doesn't need to be, kind of the Harvard Business School style. It can be somebody in the arts or somebody interested in solving a local problem. And so there's that sense of opening up the doorway to everybody, not just to the business school candidates, but to everybody. And I want to link that to something else you talk about in the book, and that is the importance of pulling a team together. When you pull a team together, you have to make sure that that team reflects that diversity, because you have a diverse team, you get better ideas, you get better results. So talk a little bit about that connection as well, the diversity of teams and why that's so important.
Sure, happy to talk about that. First of all, you're right in terms of the emphasis on everyone. In fact, you'll see the subtitle of the book is very deliberately how anyone can turn an unsolved problem into a breakthrough success. And that's really, again, been the nature of this kind of teaching approach and the workshops that I've done. And it was my students who put me up to writing a book. They were the ones who said, you're actually not doing the third step. You had such impact on our lives, but you're not scaling. And I said, boy, that's really true. What do you think about that? And they said, you should write a book. And I thought, well, okay, I had never published anything. I had never written a book, but they said, you should do that and it'll help scale this process. And so that's where it came from. Yeah, you're right. I talk a lot in the book, and I talk a lot about it in my teaching too, about really the most important elements of constituting a team are that the team is diverse and that you embrace the unique capabilities of everybody on the team. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I rely a lot on the academic research in the fields of entrepreneurship and related fields like sociology and psychology and other fields, mostly social sciences, to substantiate all these claims. And it's very clear that the most successful teams in any innovation field are the most diverse. And they're ones who are diverse, representing all different kinds of characteristics, definitely gender and race, also different personality types, especially introverts, extroverts, different skill sets, different orientations of brain function. Are you left brain? Are you right brained? Where you come from, having as much creative diversity in that mix enhances the ability of a team to succeed. And I talk a lot about that in the book. And again, I cite lots of the research associated with it. But what's really important, and I cite the research associated with this too, is the companion word that lots of us have heard for many years, which is inclusion. Because diversity is about, the metaphor is being invited to the dance. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And both are really important. And I'll show you, if it's okay, I'll share my screen again and just show you a brilliant graphic that helps to illustrate this. This is a graphic from Frances Frey at Harvard Business School and Ann Morris, her colleague. And it demonstrates through these three Venn diagrams an actually dangerous consideration, which is here is a diverse team on the left where it only embraces what the different team members share in common. And it's actually a relatively small piece of what everybody is bringing to the table. Here in the middle is a homogeneous team where they're embracing all the homogeneity of everybody on the team. And actually, in this case, the data show that the homogeneous team actually outperforms the diverse team. What you need in order to outperform a homogeneous team is both diversity and inclusion, where you're encouraging everybody to be their authentic self, to bring their full selves to the table. And here you're embracing all of what everybody's able to bring. And here by far, diverse and inclusive teams outperform homogeneous teams. And I talk about examples in the book, and I talk about some of the research associated with this. Linda Hill, who's a wonderful professor, former professor of mine at Harvard Business School, talks about this phrase that she espouses called creative abrasion, where people abrade against each other in certain productive ways. And they do so because they come from different points of view. They bring different backgrounds to the table, different races, different genders. And as a result, those inclusive teams that are both diverse and inclusive perform really well. And so one of the reasons that I emphasize that so much is that 65% of all venture teams fail because of some issue related to their team not being diverse or not being inclusive or not getting along. And so team formation, team management, team leadership is an absolutely critical part of this entrepreneurial process. I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah. So I know that's a little bit later in this seesaw scale process in the book. So let's back up a second. The first step in your process, the C problem, involves a technique that you call bottom-up research. And we gave everybody a head start by putting the video link in the promotions for the event, in the notice for the event. So why don't you take us into the classroom and see who was paying attention? So
I will do that. Maybe I can share my screen while we're doing that. And if you weren't able to watch the video, we can do a little bit of review. But here's a slide that will show you a little bit about what we even mean by bottom-up research. You're right, it is the key element that I teach in my classrooms and in the workshops I do around the world that helps you do the first step of the process, which is to find and validate an unmet need. So when we talk about bottom-up research, we're talking about finding that need. What's the problem you want to solve? And the reason I'm so enthusiastic about starting here is often I'm surrounded by technology people, and I bet there's lots of people on this Zoom call right now who would identify as technology people. And unfortunately, not only, but especially technology people, and I'm not accusing any of you here, fall into the trap of being what I call a solution in search of a problem. And that's a really dangerous place to be, because it's just then by luck that you would be stumbling onto a problem to solve with your technology or your proposed solution. And so I say, no, let's start with defining the problem. And the way I talk about this process is, again, finding and validating an unmet need. And those of you who watched the video will remember that I talked a little bit about the idea of being an anthropologist. That anthropologists are really good at doing what I call bottom-up research, and that is observing and listening to people behaving naturally, doing what they do normally in their own environments. That could be in an office, it could be at home, it could be in a hospital, a doctor's office, or the other word I use in the video and in my teaching and in the writing is empathy, or putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Or I mentioned in the video that when I was teaching a number of Japanese faculty members, they described with a different metaphor. They said synchronizing your hearts, which is a metaphor I really liked. It's about observing and listening without pitching, not trying to sell anybody anything, not telling somebody, boy, I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, but actually I'd like to criticize your shoes and sell you a new pair of shoes. That's not what we mean by empathy. We're talking about, at least in this first part of the process, to just understand the way that people are living their lives. Not doing surveys or focus groups, because those are not normal ways of interacting with people. Those are very contrived ways. And yet it's very tempting with SurveyMonkey or Google surveys to quickly run out and do a survey. But that's, again, a very contrived way of observing or listening to people. And not even at this earliest stage where we don't have a solution in mind. We're just looking to understand what other people are experiencing, not asking people for feedback. There may be time down the road to do that, but not right now. And again, these are cautions that I share with my students and with others all over the world. And so maybe what we'll do is, I had posed a few prompts to some people who were able to watch the video originally. I don't want to put anybody on the spot to tell me whether you watched the video, but what I'd like to do is engage all of you in the chat. And there's no right or wrong answer. I'm always curious. I do this all over the world. I'd love to know what surprised you. Often when I hear what surprised people, it gives me some insight in what did you get out of the watching the video experience. And again, no right or wrong answer. I'd love everybody who watched the video, just put one thing in the chat that you found surprising about that video. And I'll just pause for a moment and see what people put down. I like that word, trashing. Yeah, Barry says, surprising that entrepreneurship is structured. Yeah, that's really interesting. No focus groups, no surveys. The Tide story. Aaron liked the Tide story. I'm glad at least one of you liked the Tide story. You don't think technology affords? That's good. Malcolm has a counterexample. I thought it was good to know that you don't need to have something fully baked yet. Yeah, opportunities everywhere. So we don't have to go in order, but Barry, maybe you could tell us why you found it surprising that entrepreneurship is structured. And you can, is Barry able to unmute himself? Yeah.
Well, it just, I was like the counterexamples that, you were mentioning, like, oh yeah, it has to be a eureka moment or something like that, that it's genius just flowering, or, I've never started, a company or a big effort or anything like that, although I've been involved with various things. So I never had any reason to stop and think about it. And I assume that you highlight it because it is surprising. I mean, you're not teaching to tell people what they already know.
Yeah. Yeah, so you're right that often this is one of the themes that people find most surprising. Last month, I did a workshop. It was the biggest workshop I'd ever done. It was for 2,400 people online with 300 breakout rooms. It was for PwC. By the way, an example of probably an approach we wouldn't have taken before COVID. So maybe we're being entrepreneurial now in it and after it. And the thing that most people found surprising was the idea that entrepreneurship could be a structured process, something that you could learn, you could master it, and then you could apply it. Because most of them said, maybe like you did, Barry, that they hadn't really considered themselves entrepreneurial because they thought they would have had to have been born that way, or that it was something that you were endowed with, or you had, again, entrepreneurial spirit. And so that is often surprising to a lot of people. Let's see, a couple of you mentioned Aaron, and one other person mentioned, oh yeah, Aaron maybe twice mentioned it, the Tide story. What did you find surprising about that? There's such good learning from the Tide story. I'd love to know what you in particular found surprising there.
I really was just, I after my husband got home from his job, I related the Tide, I had to relate the Tide story to him. I was just so fascinated by it. You know, that that the woman didn't have a problem because she fixed it, right? She didn't have a problem. And I, you know, for me, there's a good amount tied up there with gender that, you know, there's sort of a workaround mentality. And I'm always interested in the amount of work that people will put into finding a better way to do something. And I think I just really identify with that idea.
Yeah, and you're right. And
as
often,
simple as I'm going to poke a hole in this box with
Yeah.
the tool that I have here in my kitchen.
yeah, and I think that's a wonderful way of thinking about it, which is she didn't really think about herself as having a problem because she had fixed it herself, to the point where the brand people who are like, you know, laundry nerds, they know more about laundry than anybody in the world, they didn't know. And this was many years into the history of Tide. And so it took the Tide team doing something that they hadn't necessarily thought would produce some insight, but very smartly did. And that was not even just doing what I ask people to do, listening at least 80% of the time, meaning you're not talking for most of the time, but that wasn't even enough. They had to watch people behave, again, anthropologically. I have so many students who come back to me and they say, do you still tell the Tide story? Because they'll never forget it. And it's a little bit of, you know, P&G lore, it's part of training, but it's a really instructive way to think about what really matters in this kind of bottom-up research. Mary, you said something that I'm intrigued by, which says, I thought it was good to know that you don't need to have something fully baked yet. That's a really profound statement. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about what that means to you.
Well, I feel like it kind of gave me permission to say, I think this is something that there might be a niche for it. And maybe it's something worth, I'm sorry, the cat's stepping all over my knitting needles. I thought there might be a niche for it, and maybe I can keep cogitating on it and keep noodling on it until like I get a bigger picture of it, rather than having to stand there and say, here's my plan for this. You know,
right? I think that's a good point, which is, you know, I'll remind us of this slide, which is the most exciting phrase to hear in science. The one that heralds new discoveries is not eureka, but rather, that's funny. I think that's kind of what you're saying, right? Which is that in this very first part of the process, you know, the C stage, all we're looking for is the problem. And we may not even really be able to define it in great detail, but that, you know, weird feeling in the back of our neck of, that's funny, you know, why is the cat walking on knitting needles here? And why is that crazy woman stabbing the side of the box? And why are people washing broccoli with Dawn dishwashing liquid? Or the pre-mama team from my class, why are all these pregnant women coming into the nutrition aisle looking so unhappy, pulling bottles of prenatal vitamins off the shelf when these, you know, 18-year-olds didn't even really understand what prenatal vitamins were? All you need to do at this stage is do what you just said, which is to pay attention to that uncomfortable feeling like there's something wrong. Why is the cat walking on knitting needles? You don't have to know anything more at this stage that would indicate even defining the problem more clearly, let alone defining a solution or a business plan or a sustainability model. No, let's break the process down to its component parts. Let's do number one first, which is to really understand that there's an issue here. We may not yet have fleshed out what the issue is. And so I love the fact that you're all sharing about surprises. It helps me understand sometimes what is most instructive in this teaching. And for those of you who didn't have an opportunity to watch that video, I hope you will watch it, and I hope you'll gain something from it. Most people do. If you're not a video person, you can, of course, read the book, and the book highlights a few of the details and provides the methodology for doing bottom-up research. I think it's the type of thing, I even say this in the book, where I drive my family crazy, because once you start doing it, you can't turn it off. You know, you'll be at the airport and you'll be looking at the people in line at TSA, or you'll be at the supermarket or a doctor's office, and you will just start noticing things. You won't be able to connect the dots yet, but you'll be able to put some dots on paper to say, that's interesting. You'll be the Isaac Asimov saying, that's funny. And that's where you know you're onto something. And so I don't know that we have time to dig too much more into the video you watched, but George, do you want to give us a little direction about where we might go next?
Yeah. What's fascinating is this is the first stage, and I think you've identified that curiosity, like what is going on, and then being observant and going down there to find out what the problem is, and that's kind of going deep in an anthropological sense. And I think that's a great lesson that came right out of it. I think would be a good idea to shift to something that is more obviously related to long-term thinking, which is kind of our passion here, and that is when you hear about entrepreneurs, or you hear about the unicorns, and it's all short-term focused, and startups have that necessity of having a short-term focus. But you also draw into the structured process a way of kind of breaking that mold a little bit and getting a broader view. And so I want to ask you to talk about that and the way you deal with that.
Sure. You're right. So I think you're talking about the third stage in the process, the scale process. And it's an interesting challenge, because when I started teaching, wouldn't necessarily have thought that would be a difficult thing, to think big, to think long-term. I would have thought that my 18 to 22-year-old students would have relished the opportunity in a classroom at Brown to be told, like, no holds barred, think as boldly as you can. And my first students, when I challenged them to do that, came up with some new venture ideas of like a new cafe on Thayer Street, which is the main street that cuts through Brown's campus. And I thought, that's so underwhelming. Like, the problem you're identifying isn't very big, let alone the solution. And so I realized, actually, it's a difficult thing for anybody from scratch to think big. And there's some psychological reasons for that. There's this concept of mental fixedness, of not being able to get beyond the way we normally conduct our thinking and our living. But I think what I'm going to do is call in a collaborator, a mentor, a teacher of mine, if that's okay. Bob Johnston, who's also a member of RSA with George, and we three have gotten to know each other. Bob and I have worked together in various contexts, and I am greatly indebted to Bob and to his colleague Marta and his colleague Doug for contributing enormous amounts through all the years I've taught at Brown. Every single semester I've taught at Brown since that fateful tap on the shoulder in 2005, Bob and Doug and Marta have been there to help teach the class. And they are the authors of this great book, which I commend to everybody, The Power of Strategy Innovation. And they are the founders and principals of a firm that I'm also affiliated with called Strategy Innovation Group. I use an exercise that Bob will tell us a little bit about in terms of its history, and I've adapted it, called the landscape exercise. And it's detailed in the book, so we're not going to detail it here in a lot of specificity, but we'll give you a little bit of orientation around it. And maybe, Bob, you could help kick that off, and then I'll share a couple of examples of how we've used it that appear in the book. George, that was the topic you wanted us to focus on. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right, good.
Yeah, so Bob, welcome. Come on board. Love to hear from you.
Great. Thanks, Danny. Hi, George. Doug Marta and I have enjoyed watching Danny adapt some of our strategy innovation tools to his entrepreneurship methodology and share them in See, Solve, Scale. So we've got an opportunity here to do a little bit deeper dive on one of the many techniques that you'll find in See, Solve, Scale. As Danny mentions in an early chapter, one of our challenges is to overcome the inner biases we bring to the entrepreneurial process. Some might think of it as the inner game of successful entrepreneurship. The landscape exercise is a technique that uses metaphorical thinking to reveal false or hidden assumptions, gaps in our planning, counterproductive relationships, and myopic or self-limited thinking. Emma Butler, in her wonderful video earlier in the session, credits the landscape exercise with her ability to begin thinking about the 600 million women around the world that might be able to use her new line of clothing. We first began experimenting with analogies and metaphors for inspiring unobvious insights in the late 70s. We were following the lead of George Prince and Bill Gordon from Cambridge at Synectics, who pioneered making the familiar strange to break existing paradigms. As far as I know, the first use of the landscape exercise was with the Buffalo Philharmonic Orchestra players to assist them in their development of a strategy to end a contract dispute with management. The negotiation became very contentious and public with front page coverage in the local press. The players were upset with the Philharmonic's management had invested so heavily in a young but globally famous conductor, Michael Tilson Thomas, to be its musical director. And the players believed their value had been negatively and even unfairly impacted, and an adjustment was needed in their compensation. They were given the landscape exercise, and the landscape exercise isn't complicated. The players were asked to draw their current situation as a road on a landscape that they were traveling. What are all the key negative and positive features on the near and distant horizon they are traveling through? And then next, we asked them to draw the organization as a vehicle or an automobile traveling this road and label all the parts. What make and year is the automobile? What shapes it in? Who or what is the engine? Is there a steering wheel? Who or what is behind it? What about brakes and an accelerator? Who or what is in the front seat? And what about the trunk, and so on? And the players had a significant breakthrough just doing this simple metaphorical exercise. And what happened was the players found themselves placing this world famous conductor as the hood ornament on the Philharmonic's car. Now more steadfast in their position, based on a metaphorical insight, a new, more fair contract was negotiated within a few days with the Buffalo Philharmonic's management. And I should also mention that Mr. Thomas continues his legendary career with the San Francisco Philharmonic. Briefly, in another more recent use of the landscape exercise, and please keep in mind the value in the book of limited resources, we were working with an Arab plastics company to improve their ecosystem for innovation. Their big aha from this drawing that they created was that they came away with an automobile illustration of their organization with 6 spare tires tied on top of the roof and a barely functioning engine. So these kinds of insights are the kinds of things that align people. They raise and make visible things that previously weren't. And Danny, please share a few examples of how you've adapted the landscape exercise for the scale phase and a few other stories.
I'll just do that very briefly. And again, I'm indebted to Bob and Doug and Marta for their contributions, and I've adapted them for the use in the more of the entrepreneurial world in which I live. I first used it when I was doing some work with a wonderful group, maybe some of you are familiar with, called Seeds of Peace. Is anybody familiar with Seeds of Peace? So Seeds of Peace was originally a camp in Maine that was designed to bring Israeli and Palestinian teenagers together for the summer. And I have the privilege of working with their alumni group, and I do some teaching about entrepreneurship in Jordan and in London and in Jerusalem and other places in Ramallah. And one time I was asked to work with a group of them in these Seeds Fellows in London, and I realized that I was asked to do a bottom-up research workshop. And actually, when I was at breakfast, I was hearing how small they were all thinking about their vision of the kinds of projects they were working on. And I realized I need to cancel my wife's and my sightseeing for the morning and completely retool the workshop. And I designed a landscape exercise approach where I helped, just like Bob said, I asked them to draw a metaphor just in kind of stick figure format of a road that is stretching 50 years into the future. And the idea was to get them out of their mental fixedness of being focused on all the challenges, the feasibility challenges they were facing today with checkpoints and borders that you couldn't cross. I asked them to draw a picture of a car, metaphorical car that would traverse that road. And then I eventually asked them to invent a solution backwards. Those are three quick elements. And I remember also the resistance that these Seeds Fellows initially were putting up with, oh, I'm a terrible artist. I can't really think that way. I'm not a good right-brain person, but they pushed through it and they came up with wildly more expansive and much bolder and bigger visions of the kinds of ventures they were imagining starting. One woman I remember named Hagit, who was looking to start a bilingual school, an Arab and Jewish school, speaking Arabic and speaking Hebrew, in a tiny, tiny level, all of a sudden was thinking about very different level of boldness just by using this metaphorical technique. The last example I'll share is a classmate of mine named Patrick Moynihan, who had been spending the last 30 years since we graduated building a school, a single unit school in Haiti that was doing great work to change the lives of a small number of students. It was a Catholic school. Patrick's a Catholic deacon. He was doing great work, and he thought, I will surely be able to raise money from some very wealthy potential donors. And he was frustrated because none of these donors, even though they liked what he was doing, was willing to support him. And I said to him, I think you're thinking too small. I think if you were asking for more money and your vision was much bigger, these very wealthy donors would get behind it. And he used the landscape metaphor exercise that we're hinting at here to do that by eventually painting the picture of a network of about 1,000 schools in Haiti that would revolutionize the way that education works and the economy works throughout the entire country. He painted a much bigger, much bolder vision, went back to those same donors and raised an unprecedented amount of money and other resources that have transformed the way that this originally Haitian project and now called Haitian Network is operating. So that's just a little bit of a hint at some of the method that you'll find in the third step of the scale of C-Solve scale. And again, comes from the great work that Bob and Doug and Marta did before me and the mentorship they had for me and my students.
Danny and Bob, thanks. And I'm interested in your thoughts about particularly the landscape exercise as something that can apply to anyone anywhere trying to chart a path forward. I mean, that's part of what long now thinking is about, is okay, we have to visualize a long term. We have to get our imagination wrapped around the long term. And part of the difficulty people have is, how do you even imagine? How do you even imagine the future? And then if you imagine something, there's the process of how the heck do we get there? And what I like about that process that you describe is the use of metaphor. So we're not actually trying to, describe the bricks and mortar and, the technical process. We're trying to create a vision, and then we're trying to create an aspiration, and we're trying to get somewhere. So is that something that, is kind of a universal possibility? And you can also go out farther than just, I mean, really, Danny, 2050 is right around the corner. So
it certainly is. I am going to let Bob answer those fundamental questions, but I'll tell you, when I first posed that challenge to Hagit, this young educator who was looking to do something basically today, of bringing Arab children and Jewish children together to coexist, there were so many feasibility challenges that she was struck by that it was impossible for her to actually envision something much bigger. And what she really needed to do, and I think, as Bob said, is to relax her bias, to break her mental fixedness. And fixedness is a challenge that you have to overcome in all three of these. You want the Tide people wouldn't have seen the woman stabbing the side of the box, and the Dawn dishwashing liquid brand wouldn't have seen people washing fruits and vegetables unless they had broken their fixedness by actually going into someone's house and watching them do that. Hagit wouldn't have thought of a much bolder vision of a network of schools. Patrick wouldn't have thought about a network of schools in Haiti unless he initially had broken his mental fixedness that was so stuck on the near-term challenges. It's why I loved including Long Now in the book, because I had never seen or heard of anybody breaking their mental fixedness with a 10,000 year horizon. That alone has that purpose for my students of saying, what would life be in 10,000 years? You're right, not in 2050, but in 10,000 years. And I think then when you rewind and you're back today, your mind is so much more open to more creative and much more bolder approaches than it would have been if you're starting today and moving forward with all the feasibility challenges that you're stuck with. Bob, do you want to share your point of view there?
Well, not much to add, Danny, except to say that, George, I really do believe that the landscape exercise does apply to the kind of situation you're describing for Long Now Boston. And let me make it even more succinct. And that is what the landscape exercise is really trying to do is to align as many of the players as possible on what a preferred scenario, what a preferred future, what a possible future might be for this organization or any organization, and then plan backwards in time, identifying what those critical milestones are that need to be realized to achieve that preferred future. And that's not limited to any organization of any charter. It really is completely open. I've never seen it not produce value in hundreds of times.
That's great. And it's an important lesson, I think, for all of us. We're going to go to kind of a question. We're going to get questions from the chat and an opportunity for people to chime in. But Danny, I had one more thing I wanted to ask you about before we go to the chat questions. And that is, in the book, you talk about the Japanese word ikigai, and
ikigai.
its relationship to the qualities that people like Emma Butler bring to the table. So just a little bit about ikigai.
Sure. I'm so glad you asked, because it's such a critical part of what I think the whole methodology is about. first of all, a little bit of a shout out to my youngest daughter, Marin, who introduced me to the concept. Ikigai is a Japanese word that means living a purposeful life. Because you can do all of the elements of the C-solve scale very effectively. You can convene a diverse and inclusive team. You can find an unmet need. You can iterate around a small scale value proposition. You can ace the landscape exercise. And you're actually not going to be successful unless you surround it by an approach that I think is embodied in this word Ikigai, and it encompasses 4 pillars. The first is drive, or something that you're really good at. The second is passion, doing something that you really love to do. The third is purpose, which is doing it to have meaningful impact on the world. And the fourth is doing it in a way that is going to be financially rewarding so that you're getting compensated for the value that you're adding. And I don't think we have to look any further than Emma Butler, actually, back to the earliest part of the conversation. When we saw Emma, I mean, she is such a moving person because she embodies all 4 of those. You can tell she is really good at what she's doing. You can tell she loves what she's doing. You can tell she really cares about the meaningful impact that Intimately is having on the world. And then you can tell also by hearing about the over $1 million in seed funding and the manufacturing she's starting, it's developing a sustainability model that is going to be paying her and her company fairly for the value she's adding. And so I think it's so critical, and it's often the ingredient that's missing. I was a venture capitalist for a number of years. I talk about a scenario in the book where somebody came to me with what looked like the most beautiful business plan, perfectly buttoned up. It could have been a Harvard case study. And I turned it down because it was so clear that this person didn't have those 4 elements of Ikigai. It was not something necessarily he was going to be great at doing, that he loved doing, that was going to be adding meaningful impact on the world. It might have been something that was financially rewarding, but that was not nearly enough. In my experience, successful entrepreneurs of all types, Jane Wayman is a good example of this too, have to have all 4 of those in line. And I think that extends also way beyond entrepreneurship. I think I wrote an op-ed piece about the Great Resignation recently, and it applies to anybody doing anything. I think if you use that as a template for figuring out what you might do or why you might be unhappy doing what you're currently doing, it'll be instructive to help you figure out some next steps to shift gears if you have to, or to feel confident about moving ahead with whatever venture you're deciding to pursue. So I appreciate your ending there because it is such a critical part of the whole process.
Wonderful, Danny. So now we're looking for some questions. It's been quiet in the chat. I think people have been listening hard, and I see Bob's colleague Marta is on the chat. So made a great comment there. So feel free to put your questions up there
Or comments. It could be a comment as well.
Yeah. And I guess I don't know, Danny, what do you think about running the Gwen video that about another one of your students? It's very moving.
Okay, we can do that.
So in the meantime, there's a couple of minutes of a video, and people can think about their questions and pop them in the chat. And the very last thing we do before we close is go to kind of an informal. We all go down to the bar, but we don't have a bar, so we'll open up we'll open up the floor to everybody in about 10 minutes or so. But let's listen to this video and get a last chance for people to ask their questions or make comments in the chat.
Let's see.
As I was reading C-solve scale, the thing that stuck out to me the most was the idea of like a need that is kind of like a need that the customer feels they need to badly solve. I think is described as like hair on fire. For many young children who are growing up in places like Zimbabwe, where the language of instruction is English, but the language that you speak at home is a different indigenous language. So for me, that language was Shona. So if you're a Shona speaking child and you're coming into school and immediately from the first grade, you're expected to transition to learning in English, that transition can be very hard. So the solution that we came up with was an idea to start a publishing house that publishes children's books in different indigenous languages. And that way it would solve as kind of like a bridge for the language that the child knows at home to the language that they would then later speak in life. When we published the first book, which was called Greedy Gutty, the plan then was to sell a copy of that book for $12. But by the time that I moved back home, I think I moved back home in September, and sometime 2 weeks after I landed, the exchange rate, I think basically the economy tanked, and the exchange rate that was previously 1:1, $1 to $1 Zimbabwean dollar skyrocketed, and a book that was previously $12 became over $1,000. At some point, you're like, maybe the timing isn't right, or maybe something isn't quite right. So I actually started working on a completely different venture, and I'm sure I'll be using some of the techniques that I learned. And that I'm now like reminded of reading your book. So my experience with Toreva was instrumental, I think, in kind of making me think that I can go ahead and now work on this new venture that I'm working on, which is called dobadoba.com. It's kind of an e-commerce site. The idea, I guess, to put it, would be kind of like an Amazon for Zimbabwe. It's one of those things where you're like, I see the value that a company like Amazon brings to a country, right? And it's a shame that we don't have that. And it's also an opportunity. And it started in the middle of last year. And I think even already I can see just how much quicker we've been able to move from like see to solve and now to thinking about scale.
Yeah, that's a great video, Danny. Thank you. And it actually addresses one of the questions that's in the chat from Malcolm Burwell. Malcolm, you had a couple of questions. Do you want to lean in here and take the floor for a minute?
Sure thing. We've been very positive through all of this, but the world is full of businesses that don't achieve. And of course, while the business is still floating, you desperately pivot and try and on somebody else's dime, keep it going. You may be in a different direction, but eventually some businesses have to close their doors. I'm just kind of curious. I mean, but by dealing with young people, Danny, you see the beginnings and you see statistically some of the successes. But I would have guessed that most entrepreneurs don't succeed with their first business. And so I'm kind of curious about how you sustain your entrepreneurialism through that kind of minefield.
That's a really good question. You know, I'm conscious of the fact that we talked a little bit about C, and you watched a video about C, and we talked at some length about scale. We didn't really talk that much about solve. And inherent in especially the solve stage, you may remember before I glossed over, but I mentioned it's where you have tolerance for failure, where you iterate very deliberately. You don't get it right the first time. The key, and actually the key for Gwen, was she was not really yet into a scale stage for Toreva when she hit the contextual challenge, that minefield that made it cost prohibitive for her to use the model that she imagined was going to work, that ultimately wasn't. And so she didn't have a lot of resources baked into the model yet. And you're right, that magical word pivoting, or at least fashionable word pivoting, the worst time to do that is when you've raised a lot of money, your whole reputation is on the line, a lot of people are watching, you have a whole distribution channel that's filled with your products, there is a lot at stake there when you fail. And that happens, there's no question. But the ideal time for it to happen is when you can iterate pretty inexpensively, pretty cost effectively at this stage, when there's not a lot of people watching, when you can take a step forward and a step back and iterate pretty cost effectively. You can use that fashionable phrase of failing fast and failing cheap. The key too, and I talk a lot about institutionalizing failure in whatever organization you are embarking on entrepreneurship with, where you make it not only less costly to fail, but where you encourage failure. Google X is a really good example of that, where they take on massive innovation opportunities and they encourage people to push the envelope to the point where they're going to fail. Encourage means rewarding people for failing, which I know sounds a little strange, but that's where that's one of the I think organizational ways that you can overcome the resistance. And by the way, that resistance varies culturally. I was on NPR the other day and people were out and the announcers were asking me about that. You know, is this technique something that you can use in any culture, or does it vary culturally? It definitely varies. When I'm in China, no one wants to say the word failure. When I'm in Israel, people wear failure on their sleeve. They know that it's just part of the process. When I'm in Silicon Valley, everybody kind of is proud of the lineup of startups that they've had that haven't quite worked. I talk a lot about the Casper mattress company that was started by two of my students. And they failed several times before they got to the point in Casper that they really hit on something. The key again, though, was they failed at an iterative level at the solve stage, not when they've already layered on lots of resources. The mistake, especially in big companies, and I do a lot of consulting with big companies and big organizations, I see is they jump right from the C stage to the scale stage. Oh, we've got all this money, we've got all this distribution, we've got all these salespeople. We know we're right by understanding this problem. We did Danny's bottom-up research. Yeah, we don't have to really iterate and try things on a small level. Let's put the accelerator down to the floor and let's layer on lots of resources to the scale stage. And that's the most expensive way to do it. It's sort of like saying the worst time to realize you have a flaw in the house that you've scheduled to build is after the house is already built. The best time to understand that is when you're still at the blueprint stage or maybe at the model stage, and you can iterate to the point where you can overcome some of those flaws. They're inevitable. It's just the way that entrepreneurship works. The best way to overcome that, though, is to time it effectively.
Well, that's a great segue. Jennifer, I'll turn it back to you. We'll close the official part, and anybody who wants to stick around.
Can I just say one other thing
Sorry,
real quick? I see that there are other questions. People are welcome to reach out to me directly, and I'm also going to put two additional links in the chat. One is I invite you all to join an alumni network that my students have created, and I'll consider you all now official Warshay alumni on LinkedIn. And I think, George, you mentioned before the C-Solve Scale network that is also there for anybody who's, I'll at least say, a supporter of the book. And again, I'll consider you all supporters of the book, whether or not you're a reader. And so I'll put both of those LinkedIn groups. No pressure, but you're certainly welcome. The first one, the Warshay Innovation Network, will connect you with entrepreneurs who are doing amazing things all over the world from all of my workshops and courses. And the C-Solve Scale Network will connect you with a smaller group, but a growing group of fans of the book and of the methodology. And I encourage you to join both if you like and contribute and ask questions and interact with each other however you would.
Yeah, that's great. I think you must have read the scale section of the book too. Now you're scaling up. That's great.
Well, at least I'm listening to my students who are way more experienced and smarter than I am in applying it. So I think that may be true.
Yeah. All right. So don't go away. We'll be back, Jennifer.
Yes, don't go away. Thank you, Danny. Thank you for sharing those links. And for those of you who do have a couple of questions outstanding, there will be an opportunity to chime in just a couple of minutes here. But as George mentioned earlier, we have a longstanding tradition after our Long Now Boston events that we hold in person. We travel down to the bar that's on the first floor of the Cambridge Innovation Center, where we host our in-person events. And we don't do that now, of course, but we do like to continue an informal conversation after the series where we have our invited guests. But first, I'd like to give a big thank you to Danny and to you also, Bob, for this incredible discussion. It's been really, really terrific. Thank you. And thank you, George, for a terrific job of hosting as always. And I'd like to also make a note of our hardworking production team, people working behind the scenes to make these conversations a success. Gary, Mary, and Kim, thank you so much. So please, I'd like to invite you all to visit our website, Long Now Boston, follow us on social media at Long Now Boston, become a member, volunteer, please join our group. We'd love to have you. We hope you come back and visit us soon and frequently. Watch your mailboxes for our next Eventbrite announcement for our May event, a conversation with Martin Elvis, Chasing Oumuamua. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. I stumble with that a little bit. And now please stick around. We hope you'll join us for an open chat with Danny and Bob. And those of you who need to leave, thank you for joining us this evening. Please stay well, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Yeah,
And
thanks, Jennifer. Yeah.
and Mary and George and Bob and Marta.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure.
So if Barry is still on the line, he was very active in the chat. He had to put a couple of good things in there, and if he could come back in. Barry, are you? Can you unmute and kind of put your 2 bits up? I guess Barry is not there.
Maybe Barry's a basketball fan and he's watching the play.
He could be, but he had it was one little clip in his comments that I really it tickled me in the video you did of the class, and you're kind of going through the process with that class. That was the video we sent, but the whole gorilla thing, it's just amazing, and it's just crazy. So Danny, talk a little bit about that, because you used that in I think in 2 examples, right? In the video, one was the traditional one of the ball. You're supposed to count the number of balls that are flying around, and during the middle of this video, a guy in a gorilla suit walks past. It's impossible to miss, right? Except people who are task focused on the balls and counting the balls will not see the gorilla, right?
Well, I mean, the truth is we're all task focused. We all have what's called inattentional blindness. That's the fancy phrase. We're all human. This is in the book. I caution us about 11 common errors that entrepreneurs often make, which are a function not about being stupid, just about being human. They're a function of our cognitive biases that are with us from birth and that get reinforced over time. And one is that we stay very focused on the task at hand and try to, leave any distractions out of the way. The first time I saw that video, I missed the gorilla, and I thought that had to be a trick. How could that possibly have happened? How could I have missed a gorilla walking in front of my face? Well, for 30 years, the Tide brand people didn't know that people were stabbing the side of their Tide boxes. And the Dawn dishwashing liquid people didn't know that the people using Dawn dishwashing liquid were washing broccoli. We're so attuned to see the world the way we're trained to see it that we're going to miss things that in retrospect look obvious. And I don't want to ask anybody now who missed the gorilla, but it's very typical. The research says that over 50% of any group will have missed it. And actually, the funniest experience I had with that video was recently when I showed the video to a group of students at Brown, And one person said he missed it, and he had actually missed it a previous time too. I never saw that before. That is such an important thing. The slide example is a function of what Barry was asking, I think, in terms of what I claim about the burden of abundant resources. And one of
I'm
those,
back.
what's that? Okay. And that one of
I'm
those
back.
resources can be that you are too well trained in an area. The people who missed the gorilla on the top of that lung tissue slide were extremely well trained. They were board certified radiologists in looking through a microscope and looking for certain types of abnormalities in lung tissue. They were so well trained that they wouldn't see the gorilla because they were never trained to look for a gorilla. Whereas maybe somebody like one of you or me, who's not been trained as a board certified radiologist, has the benefits of not having that much advanced training. That's proven true in lots of my student startups. Ben Chesler from Imperfect Foods is one that we highlight in the book. Emma herself is one where she didn't have any training in doing a lot of what she was doing, and yet she was able to do it. The Casper founders knew nothing about the way mattresses were manufactured and distributed and sold and delivered, except that you slept on a mattress. And it was their benefits of scarce resources, the less they knew, worked in their favor. Now, to your point, Barry, that's not universally true, but sometimes it does tip the odds in your favor, that it is an advantage to having fewer resources, less money, less pedigree, less experience, less of a traditional way of doing things. And that's usually surprising to people. That's often one of the surprises I hear when I ask what was surprising. And so, Barry, I know you commented on a couple of aspects of that. Is that right?
Well, yes, because along those lines, I was also, even before seeing, trying to bring up the question here, even before seeing Emma's video, when I was thinking about, well, why am I watching this video? Why am I, attending this, session tonight? I hadn't even thought of searching for an idea, like sending somebody to Whole Foods to just, see what people need. I thought the reason to start something was because you already had an idea. So I'm wondering, well, you would think that would be a good thing. I mean, you're not just going to pair people off like, George is going to solve my idea, I'm going to solve your idea, you're going to solve George's idea, problem or whatever. But I'm wondering what the disadvantages are, the blind spots of trying to solve your own problem. I mean, I've actually worked for some of the companies that you mentioned. I think one of them is kind of famous for being like this, where, they were a solution looking for a problem. I was a summer student, so I figured, I could pretty much do or sit whenever I wanted as long as I got the job done. So, after being there for a couple of weeks, I took someone aside and said, how is this company going to make money? Why would anybody want what you're producing? So if you could address some of that.
One of the things that I think you're getting at is, what's kind of the sweet spot of a team? Should you have all people who know nothing about a situation, or should you have lots of people who are experts, or somewhere in the middle? I have a whole chapter in the book that's called the team formation sweet spot. And it turns out there's a really, really brilliant sociologist at Northwestern who studied this, a guy named Brian Uzi, and he describes the best composition as a little bit of what you're describing, where you have some people who do know something about that industry, some people who know nothing about that industry, you have some people who've worked together before, and you have some people who are completely new to the team who've not worked together before. And that composition tends to perform best over time, where you enforce all the diversity and inclusion challenges that I mentioned before. So it's a combination. I think, it's a poetic way of describing the situation. When I originally described, for example, the Casper founders, it's true, they didn't know anything about this. And I think the original inspiration came when they were able to question the status quo in a way that the incumbent established mattress companies just couldn't afford to do, because they were so focused on enabling and perpetuating the typical way a mattress was developed. Whereas the scarcity that Luke and Neil were able to enjoy, not having the burdens of any of the prior models, enabled them to push through that mental fixedness and think about completely new ways. Eventually, they did have to have people on their team that knew a little bit about manufacturing mattresses and what the typical distribution method was to get them to market. Yeah, George.
Danny, the other thing that strikes me as one of the things you talk about in terms of team formation is the tendency for people to rely on strong relationships that they already have. And the evidence that you present is that teams are actually better, entrepreneurial teams are better if they rely on weak ties. Somebody that you perhaps know, have had some contact with, but they're not close ties, because the problem with close ties is that people tend to stay in the bubble, right?
It's really true, because look, I share the evidence. Brian Uzi, Noam Wasserman, others who are researchers in these fields about what constitutes the best team. But that's not very empowering if I don't help you figure out what are you going to do about that to achieve those. So I do that. I help you understand what are some ways that you can get access to more diverse teams. And it is through your weak ties, which is surprising. There's a sociologist from Stanford who wrote a seminal article in 1973, Mark Granovetter, and it's called The Strength of Weak Ties. It's a fabulous article. It's really worth reading. And it's all about this. In fact, he was the person who coined the phrase 6 degrees of separation, because he did another related study on how closely related we are to various people nodes in our network. And so the brilliance of the strength of weak ties is, if you rely on social networks like LinkedIn and Facebook, you're going to be pulling on and tapping your strong ties. People who by definition, pretty well. They're either family members or friends, or now we're all one step away, maybe through George and Jennifer. And those people look and behave and come from backgrounds that pretty closely resemble ours. And so those are very bad ways of ensuring the kind of diversity I espoused before. Much better is to rely on weak ties, people who, as George said, you sort of know, but you have to pursue a little bit more aggressively. Those tend to lead you to people who don't look like you, who don't act like you. The tragedy in I don't know if it's a tragedy, but the challenge, at least in entrepreneurship, is over 50% of venture teams are formed from team members who come from your friends or your family. And those are, again, by definition, people who pretty much are going to look like you, behave like you, come from backgrounds like you. And as a result, those tend to be very undiverse teams. And as a result, they underperform the kinds of teams that come from your weak ties that result in more diverse teams. That's a more nuanced approach to what I said before about the diversity and inclusion issue.
Yeah. So we could continue all night, but we really shouldn't. I did want to say, Danny, that one of the things.
I like Mary's modeling.
Yeah. Oh yeah, she's got the hat. I think we just touched on it, but one of the things that struck me is that the structured process that you've put out there is not just for entrepreneurial purposes, but in the context of ikigai, purpose, looking for purpose, it's a process that really applies to individuals seeking to find their purpose. And it applies to organizations like Long Now Boston that's trying to figure out a way to encourage cultural change in the long term. You know, all of the steps that you've laid out there have applied. So it's got a universal characteristic, you know, that applies to it. So I'm envisioning for Danny Warshay and the C-Solve scale, you know, scaling up that you're doing here, that, you know, that in 2050, there will be institutions all over the world, popped in cities and, you know, implementing change throughout society. So, or on the world. So how's that?
That sounds terrific. You know, I will probably not be the one leading the charge at that time, but I have well over 3,000 students who I know are more than capable of doing that. And that's part of the legacy that I hope I'm leaving in terms of this methodology. And the very first paragraph in this book talks about lots of the challenges that we have before us. There are no shortage of challenges. What we need is people who are interested in embracing them and using a methodology that can help empower them to understand those challenges, solve them on a small scale, and then figure out a way to scale those solutions so that you can have big impact over the long term. I think if we do that, we're in a good place.
Yeah.
That keeps me optimistic and helps me sleep at night. And I hope it will all of you as well.
Very good. Danny, wonderful job. Thank you very much.